His position, the superiority of Christ in His priesthood, the superiority of Christ in His ministry, and He eventually shows the superiority of Christ working itself out in the behavior of those who have believed in Him and who follow Him. Keeping in mind, as we consider this Hebrew passage, that the Jews largely viewed Moses and Joshua as responsible for giving them rest in the land of Canaan. And the writer of Hebrews, in the context of the verses you heard read this morning, is showing the superiority of Jesus Christ over and above Moses and Joshua. As we look into that text, he begins with the warning, "Take heed, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God." And he warns his hearers on the basis of the example of the wilderness generation that came out of Egypt, yet fell in the wilderness, never having experienced the rest that God had promised. The writer of Hebrews points out that this rest is found in Jesus Christ, if indeed we hold, as he says, our original confidence or our original faith in Him firm to the very end. He goes on and he warns them, just as God warned the nation of Israel in the 95th Psalm, "Today, if you will hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the day of the rebellion." Again, referring back to the rebellion of the wilderness generation that did not receive the promised rest of God. The writer of Hebrews goes on and says that God swore that they would not enter into His rest because they were disobedient and unbelieving. And he is exhorting his hearers on the basis of the disobedience and the unbelief of the wilderness generation, and their not having received this promised rest. He goes on and he uses, and this is one reason I'm focusing on this passage this morning, he actually quotes Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, when he says, and somewhere it is spoken of the seventh day in this way, "And God rested on the seventh day from all of His works." Therefore, he connects the rest that the wilderness generation missed. He connects the rest that his hearers are in danger of missing. He connects it, Carl, back with the rest of God in Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. He says, God rested on the seventh day from His works. And then again he says, and he quotes the 95th Psalm, "They," that is the wilderness generation, "shall not enter into my rest." Therefore, the writer says there must be a rest of God that still remains. Because, after all, as the writer of Hebrews says, David's statement is far after the entering into the land of Canaan. So there is a rest of God that remains for the people of God, and that is what the writer of Hebrews is focusing upon here today. And he says if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another rest later on, or another day later on. So he concludes, then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So we see this morning that the writer of Hebrews, using the text of Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, contends that the rest of the believers in Christ, that the rest of those who believe in Christ is infinitely superior to the Canaan rest promised to the Jews. In fact, if you take his overall argument in the book, he is contending that the Canaan rest was nothing more than a type and a shadow of the true rest that is found only in Jesus Christ. What I would like to do this morning is consider our subject of a rest remaining for the people of God under three separate headings. First, we will look at the restlessness of sin. We will go back, and as you've already noted, so many of the principles that we're preaching and teaching out of the book of Genesis are radically affected by sin and the fall. Almost every one of these major principles is altered in some sense by man's rebellion and fall into sin. So we will consider first of all this morning the restlessness of sin. And we will see how that sin and rebellion against our Creator has robbed man of the rest that was originally given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Secondly, we will consider our subject under the idea of a rest remaining for the people of God. What is this rest? How would we define this rest? How is this rest obtained? And can we miss this rest? And then finally, we will conclude by looking at this under the heading of a singular deterrent to this rest. There is only one thing. There is only one thing that can rob mankind of this rest that is God's. And we shall consider that. Let's begin first of all with the restlessness of sin. We find in the early chapters of Genesis that when God placed man in the Garden of Eden, He gave him one command, and that command in the garden was to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Man had one command: don't eat of this tree. It's always interesting to me to note that not only was there a tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden, but there was also a tree of life. There were two trees there, but only one of them God commanded, you shall not eat of this tree. And we know that Adam and Eve took of the fruit of that tree and they ate of it. But the question is, why did they do that? Why did they do that? They did that in disobedience to God because they did not believe God. Let me explain to you what I'm saying here. Disobedience is the fruit of unbelief. We never find ourselves, Jose, disobeying God when we absolutely believe what He has said. It is only when our faith falters and when we fail to accept and believe what God has said that we disobey. Now, you will easily recall the temptation with which Eve and Adam were faced, and that was, what did Satan do? He questioned the goodness of God and caused them to begin to doubt what God had said, and caused them to begin to think that possibly God was withholding something good from them. And their unbelief in God, and you remember, what did God say would happen to them on the day that they ate of it? You're going to die. What did Satan say? You shall not surely die. So they began to doubt what God had said. They began to doubt that they would die. And they began to doubt that God was giving them the best that there was to have. So their disbelief, their distrust, their unbelief led them to eat of the fruit, which was in direct disobedience to the command of God. And we all are very familiar with the story, especially as I have been over it 38 times already in our consideration of the book of Genesis. But as a result of the fall, everything was cursed by God. Childbearing was cursed. Marriage was cursed. The the perfect union that they enjoyed there was cursed by God, in that the woman was now going to desire to consume all of her husband's attention upon herself, and that the husband was now going to deviantly and wickedly try